Good afternoon, everyone. This is Rob Foster, sales engineer for the Central Region. We're going to get started here in about 2 minutes. Today's topic is going to be elevator control. So hold on the line. We'll get started in about 2 minutes. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It is now 2 after the hour, so we will get started. Before we jump in, could I ask one of my team members to come off mute and let me know if you can hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Perfect. Also, Francisco, is the slide deck showing on the screen?
Showing perfectly, and I'll be monitoring the questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
So, thank you all for joining. We got a fun topic today, elevator control. You know, I mentioned that it's a fun topic because I do get a lot of questions about this. So as I put this presentation together today, I really tried to think about a lot of those questions that I get, and I'm going to try to cover, you know, a lot of that today. And of course, at the end of the session, you know, as always, we're going to leave some time for Q&A. If you have questions during the session, feel free to submit those in chat. Also, at the end of the session, feel free to come off of mute and you can ask those questions verbally as well. So let's jump in. So kind of our objectives for today, we're going to talk about the different types of elevator control. We're also going to talk about the Mercury hardware specifically that you need for elevator control. There are some caveats and things that you need to consider when we talk about this. So we're going to go through kind of a list of those things that you need to pay attention to when you're laying out your hardware to use for elevator control. We're going to go over a couple example deployments, and then I'm going to go into a configuration demo. I'm going to show you how to set up some of these various scenarios. And finally, we'll have a Q&A session. So let's start out. We'll talk about the types of elevator control. You'll notice that the first type that I listed, I called it basic, and I put elevator control in quotes because I don't really consider this true elevator control, but you know, it still is a valid means of controlling an elevator. So, and with that being said, it's really in this instance, you don't have a card reader in the cab. You know, the only place you have a card reader is beside the floor call button. And all you're doing is simply presenting a card. If you get a valid read, you enable that floor call button. Now the person can call the elevator. When they get on the elevator, they can go wherever they want. There's no controls inside the elevator cab itself. We do see this. We sometimes see this in conjunction with standard elevator control that I'll talk about in a second. But another place you might use this basic elevator control, maybe it's a 2-level facility. Public has access to floor 1, floor 2 is restricted. You know, you could just merely interrupt the call button. You know, having controls inside the cab's probably not going to benefit you a whole lot since there's only one floor that you could possibly select when you get in from the first floor. So just be aware that you can do that within the ACM software. That's just set up like a normal door. Present your card, you get a valid grant, we close the relay, and then that allows them to interface with the floor call button or use that floor call button. So what we're going to focus on more today is standard elevator control. So this is where you would typically have a card reader inside the elevator cab. So the floor call button works as normal. You can call the elevator, but once you get on the cab, you have to present your credential. Then once you do that, the floors that you are allowed to go to can be selected. Now, as I mentioned before, sometimes people will put an extra level of security where they don't want you to even be able to call the elevator without first presenting your card. So in that scenario, you'd have the card reader outside the cab, present your card, then call the elevator. Then once you get inside the elevator, you would have to present your card again, and then you would select your floor. Now, within standard elevator control, we have a couple different options. So, if you've configured this before within ACM, you've probably seen that when you do this, you have the option to select with feedback or without feedback. So the first one, probably the more common one, is without floor selection feedback. And that's what that feedback means. We're getting feedback from the elevator system as to which specific floor you selected after you presented your credential. So most people tend to not do that feedback because it does require additional hardware and additional configuration to make that happen, but that is available. So when you do select with floor selection feedback, then you're going to also, in addition to the outputs to control the elevator levels, you're going to need inputs to get that feedback back from the elevator system. So keep that in mind. And we'll talk more about this as we go into the configuration demo. The last type of elevator control I want to talk about is a software level integration. So when we talked about standard elevator control, we're talking about using relays and an input point and doing kind of some I/O logic to make that happen. If we look at a software level integration, that's where the access control system would be talking to the elevator controls directly, or in our case through a middleware platform, and there are no outputs and inputs to wire up. So we'll go a little bit into that as well as we go through the presentation today. So hardware requirements. This is, we'll go through this, and then when we talk about the additional points to consider, really hone in on this information. It's critical. You want to make sure that you get your bill of materials correct before you actually quote the project. So let's just start out at the very basic level. You need at least a controller to do elevator control. Now, I'll mention this later in the presentation. It doesn't have to be a dedicated controller. That controller can control elevator cabs as well as standard doors. Sometimes with the layout of facilities, that's not as practical. Sometimes you're installing these controls in the elevator penthouse or control room, and that's nowhere near where your access control head-in is. So a lot of people end up doing a dedicated controller. Either way is fine. Now, I mentioned the different types of controllers here. I did want to point out that the LP4502 does have some destination dispatch feature capabilities, but as of right now, those are not supported in ACM. Of course, we have other controller options as well. And then once you have a controller, you need to have a subcontroller. And that's typically the subcontroller will control your outputs, possibly your inputs if you're doing with feedback, and could also serve as your reader port. So I'll list different options here. We'll talk a little bit more about the MR52, which is a great solution if you're looking to control, 6 floors or less. It's kind of an all-in-one solution. It's got the inputs, it's got the outputs, it's got the card reader port. It's kind of got everything you need. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. So important points to consider when you're talking about elevator control. First thing is we can control up to 128 floors per cab. And that's assuming that you're using 8 MR16 output modules. So we can do up to 128 floors per cab. Now, as I mentioned before, the controller does not have to be dedicated to elevator control, but you may want to do that just because of the physical layout of the building. Maybe you want some fault tolerance. We have had some people that will do a separate controller for each cab. They don't want a controller failure to take down the entire bank of elevators. All those are legitimate strategies. So let's talk about the input and output points on the controller. Now, one of the nice features with ACM is we don't you don't have to land your inputs and outputs on specific points. So we're very flexible. However, that's different when we talk about elevator control. So keep that in mind. Your inputs and outputs on your controller board itself, so your 1502s, your 1501, you cannot use those for elevator control. They're there, but you can't use them. So another thing to keep in mind too, can't use the controller inputs and outputs, so you have to use a subcontroller. But even when you do that on a subcontroller, each subcontroller you dedicate to elevator control can only be used with one elevator cab. So here's an example, and this one catches a lot of people off guard. If you had 2 elevator cabs controlling 7 floors each, now that's only 14 inputs. Logically, you would think, oh, I only need 1 MR16 out. However, that will not work because subcontrollers have to be dedicated to one cab. So in that scenario, you would need 2 MR16 outs, 1 for each cab. Now, another topic that will come up, when you do dedicate a subcontroller to elevator control, the unused inputs and outputs cannot be used for any other functions. Can't use them to, do an input for a door grant or an output for a strobe on a door or anything like that. Basically, that subcontroller can only do elevator control. Now, some other things to consider, I mentioned before, applications that require 6 levels or fewer to be controlled. You could do an MR52. This is great too if you're going to do elevator control with feedback, because you've got your outputs and you've got your inputs all on one board. So it's going to save you space and save you money. So don't forget about that MR52. Also, you could use one of the reader ports for your elevator cab. And apologize, I think the presentation just disappeared for you all. Let me get that restarted here. There we go. So also something to configure or consider, and Francisco mentioned this on Monday when he talked about OSDP. OSDP readers are a great solution for elevator cabs, especially if you're in a high-rise facility where the cable distance is going to exceed 500 feet. In the past, people would take something like an MR50 and they would install that in the cab, and that would give them that the distance beyond 500 feet to get back to the controller. You can still do that. That's still a very valid deployment strategy, or you could simply put an OSDP reader. Now, that's less hardware in the cab, less things that you have to have the elevator control company do inside the cab. So definitely consider that. Theoretical max distance of 4,000 feet. However, check with the card reader manufacturer, to make sure that you can in fact, get the distance that you need to get. Something else to consider too is the MUX8 device, which is a multiplexer. If you are doing, one controller for maybe a bank of elevators, and maybe your strategy is you want to put an MR50, a single door controller, in the cab. To physically loop from one cab over to the other would be very difficult, and you would probably hit your 4,000, max on cable length very quickly. So if you add that MUX8 device, that will allow you to wire those MR50s in a star configuration versus a loop. So remember that device is available, and that can be your friend, and when you're trying to control multiple cabs. Something from a troubleshooting standpoint, that I want to mention: once you assign outputs to elevator control, you're not going to be able to manually activate those. So let's say you're on site, you're working with the elevator control company. They've wired up your outputs to their inputs, and now they want you to trigger them manually to make sure that they're activating correctly in their system. A couple different ways that you can handle that. You can turn off the elevator assignment for the subcontroller, and then that will allow you to manually, trigger those output points. Or you can simply do a door grant. If the elevator is completely set up, when you do a door grant on an elevator door, then you'll get an additional pop-up that asks you to select which level do you want to do a door grant on. So just keep that in mind. Finally, I think this goes without saying, elevators are regulated, and requirements from state to state differ. I've run into a lot of different scenarios, working across the U.S. In some jurisdictions, they won't allow you to mount any type of equipment in the elevator control room. In those scenarios, you have to put the equipment outside of the elevator control room and then run your output cabling back to the elevator control room. So typically, something else you run into, you all, unless you're, a certified elevator service company, you can't do any work inside the cab itself. So when you're quoting these projects, make sure you exclude the work that has to be done, by the elevator control company from your scope of work. It can be very expensive to call them out on a service call to do this. So make sure you cover yourself. If you're doing a turnkey installation for your customer, make sure that you check in with the elevator company first and get a quote for that work. So just moving on here, just going to talk about a couple elevator control examples. Now, there's many different ways you could put together elevator control, so I'm not going to come even near covering all the different possible scenarios, but I'll just talk about a few. So let's take the first example here. We have a single cab that we're going to control, and there's 16 levels that need to be controlled. So what you could see here is in the elevator control room, or wherever your head end is going to be located, I've got a controller, I've got an MR16 out, and then I'm going out, I'm going to assume my traveling cable is beyond 500 feet, or maybe I don't have 18 gauge shielded cabling for my reader, so I'm not comfortable, taking that out to the full 500 feet, whatever the case. If you want to communicate RS-485 from the elevator control room to the elevator cab, in this scenario, you would mount an MR50 in the cab, and then of course your card reader. Now, if you wanted to add multiple elevator cabs and use the same scenario, obviously keep in mind the LP1501 can only support 8 downstream devices, so keep that limit in mind. But say you were going to add a second elevator cab and you wanted to use this same strategy, this would be a good time to use that MUX8 device. So add that to your elevator control room or your head end here, and now you can do that star wiring configuration. So I'm going to jump over to example 2. Now this one, we're going to have 2 elevator cabs, and each of those cabs is going to, we're going to have 3 levels controlled for each of those cabs. So here I'm going to use the MR52. It's only got 3 levels to control. You know, it's a short distance. The traveling cable's not going to go very far. I feel comfortable using weakened. Again, I would probably do OSTP going forward, but if you want to do weakened, that's fine. You can certainly do that. And you can see here that I've got the MR52s as well as the controller mounted in the elevator control room. And then I have a wire going from each MR52 from the reader port out to the elevator cab, and then from one of the reader ports on the second MR52 out to the second elevator cab. And we'll go to my third example here. Okay, sorry, hold on just one second. It's not cycling to my third example here. And we'll try this again. Hey, Francisco, is it cycling on your end?
Oh, we're still in the example 2.
Still on example 2, okay.
Correct.
Let me see what's going on here.
And as you take care of that, just so folks on the line, if you're downloading the document, the presentation attached, the first slide has just a different name, but it doesn't have the right name in there right now. But the rest of the presentation, yep, right? Just so you know. Yeah,
and while we're waiting, I'm going to go ahead and start the first poll as I fix the presentation issue here. Again, my apologies. So we'll let people answer that poll while we're waiting. Good responses here. Yeah, thank you all for answering these polls. You know, we do take this information back. We share it with our leadership team and our product management team as well to kind of give them a better idea of, you know, how these features are being used today. Okay. And while we wait, I'm going to go ahead, if everybody's, looks like everyone has voted, I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. And I'm going to go ahead and put another poll up here if you all don't mind answering that one as well. Okay, getting some good feedback there. I apologize, I'm closing out of my presentation. We're going to relaunch it here and see if that takes care of our issue. And if it doesn't, then we will carry on with the, you know, I can talk about some of those final points and then we'll carry on with the demonstration.
Rob, I have the presentation open here in case you need it.
Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, let's see here. Okay, I think we finally have example 3. I'm sure you guys are anxiously awaiting. I did not necessarily save the best for last, but hopefully you're seeing example 3 now on your screen. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll.
Yep.
And now we will go ahead and jump. Okay, so example 3, similar to example 2, single elevator cab. We're using an MR52. distance. So there's only 6 levels to be controlled. And even though we're within weakened wiring distances, we've chosen to use the newer OSDP style reader. So again, I think this is a great option. Francisco made this point on Monday. You know, I would recommend doing this as well. You know, just as always, when you're putting together your proposal, it's always good to reach out to the elevator control company that you're going to be working with. You know, first to make sure that the elevator control equipment will support, you know, an integration with access control. I have, believe it or not, I've run into elevators that did not support this. And, you know, there were certain upgrades that had to be made to the elevator control equipment before we could integrate access control. And, you know, along with that, talk to them about the available conductors that are in the traveling cable. You want to make sure that you've got cables that are going to meet your minimum standards. The only way you're going to know that is if you talk to the elevator control company ahead of time. Okay, so one of the types, I kind of saved this for the end. You know, I mentioned before, you know, there is the possibility of doing software level integrations with elevators. You know, typically that comes in with, you know, things like destination dispatch. Hopefully at some point in the future, we'll be able to offer destination dispatch through the 4502. But there's also another solution. And I won't say that Braxos is the only solution out there, but they're one that has successfully, you know, integrated ACM with other elevator control systems. It is a third-party solution. It's not something that you know, that's resold through Avigilon. You know, you would work with them directly. Something to keep in mind: it's a customized solution. It's not just off-the-shelf software. So the pricing can be a little bit more, you know, but you can certainly reach out to the folks at Braxos, talk about your, you know, your scope or your destination dispatch opportunity and how it's supposed to work. They can give you a scope of work and ultimately provide you with pricing. Their model is they typically work with the integrator directly. You know, if there's an instance where they need to work with the end user, certainly talk to them about that. They may be open to that type of strategy as well. The things that you will need from us to be able to use this middleware solution is you're going to need to add the XML collaboration license. That's going to enable ACM to send events to Braxos, such as you present your card and get a local grant. They need to get that information very quickly so that they can enable the floors that person's allowed to go to. Might be an elevator kiosk that they're using. Maybe that they're selecting the floor automatically for the user. It could be like a beginning of the day scenario where people are coming in through turnstiles, and as they present their card, you know, the system already knows which floor they're supposed to go to, and it just simply directs them to what cab they need to get on. Of course, all that magic happens, you know, on the back end with the elevator control system, but we have to give that card read event to them quickly. So make sure you include the XML collaboration, and that simply sends all of the events from ACM out to Braxos. Also, in some cases, Braxos will need to be able to write information back to ACM, you know, things like, you know, destination, or I shouldn't say destination, but, you know, floor selection. You know, if that's required in your environment, they would need to be able to write that information back to ACM. So REST API will also be necessary. You know, they can work with visitor management systems too, so keep that in mind. You know, it's not just an integration with access control. It could be an integration with a visitor management system where visitor shows up, you need to put them in the system and give them, you know, a card or a PIN number that will allow them to use the elevator. So keep that in mind. Certainly reach out to Braxos if you have a solution where you need them. Okay, and this is just a workflow diagram, kind of really hard to read. My apologies. Probably won't jump into a whole lot of this on the call, but you can download the presentation later if you want to look at this in detail. This specific example actually has the card reader integrated in the elevator, and that card read function would be presented from the elevator system versus our access control system. So they can even work in environments like that where you have a proprietary reader or a reader that's embedded into the elevator control solution. They can still work with that, and then they can still in turn write that transaction information back to Avigilon. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is going to jump into a configuration demo. We'll walk through a couple different examples. And let me get this pulled up here real quick. Okay, so you're going to see here on the left-hand side, I'm going to access ACM, and then the right-hand side, you see that I have some hardware here set up to simulate an elevator environment. You can see here specifically, this is an elevator card reader. Here's my buttons that would be inside of a cab, basically to simulate which floors we're going to control. I'm going to use these buttons over here, but I'm going to wait till we get to that part of the demo to tell you what that's being used for. So let me get logged in. We'll talk about setting up a elevator specifically. So one of the first things you're going to want to do, and I know you can't see it here, but behind this elevator reader inside this enclosure is a 1502. It's not this 1502 that you see over here, but it is another 1502. And so that's what I'm going to use in my example to set up elevator control. Now, let's get in here real quick. The first thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to go to the panel that you're going to use for your inputs and outputs. And you're going to want to configure those for elevator control specifically. Let's go over to my input. Okay, so here's my MR52. Now, to make this available for elevator control, you'll see that under the sub-panel configuration, you have two options. You can use the board, you can use the inputs on the board and or the outputs. So here I'm going to set up an example using elevator control with feedback. So we want that floor tracking information. So I'm going to check both of these boxes. Now, once I do that, I'm going to go set up my actual elevator reader. I'm going to pop over to doors here. Sorry, the screen's bouncing a little bit there. My apologies for that. So here I've already configured the elevator. You start out configuring it as a door. I know it's an elevator, but we are going to configure it as a door to kind of start out. And how we're going to change that from being a door to a feedback is we're going to change change it from a door to being an elevator. We're going to change the access type. So here, normally, if it was a door, you'd set that to single. Since this is going to be used for elevators, we are going to change it to either elevator with feedback or elevator no feedback. My apologies. Francisco, I don't know if the screen's kind of jumping up and down for you all, but I'm going to switch over here to.
No, you're fine.
It's fine. Okay. It must be just something happening on my end. Okay. So once you configure your access type to elevator with feedback, you're going to get this elevator tab here. So let's go over here. Oops, sorry, before we go there, let's talk about the hardware piece. So once you set up your, your elevator as your access type, then you need to select which output boards you're going to use and maybe your input. Since we're doing feedback, we need to select our input boards too. In this case, I'm controlling 6 or fewer floors. I'm going to use the MR52. I'm going to use the outputs on the MR52, and I'm going to use the inputs. Now, if this were, you know, 18 floors, 19 floors. Obviously, you can't do those all on, you wouldn't be able to do that on an MR52, and you couldn't really do that on just one MR16 out. So you have options to select additional boards to control those additional floors. Now, once you select those boards, you'll have an option here to where you can go in and name, you know, your basically which inputs and outputs correspond with which floor. To keep things simple, I just named mine floor 1 through 6 to match the addresses of the inputs and outputs. You all probably won't be so lucky. You'll probably have scenarios where you've got floors that are, you know, they may skip the 13th floor. You may have floor 1A and floor 1B and mezzanine and so on and so forth. You may even have cases where you know, you've got a door that opens in the front and a door that opens in the back, and those have to be controlled separately. So things won't always line up as cleanly as they do here. So now that you have this set up, what you can do from here, before you even you know, set up access, give, you know, elevator access levels, access groups, so on and so forth, you could go and test your elevator. So I've set up the door, I've configured the hardware that's going to be used for the elevator, you know, I've named my floors, so on and so forth. So now I can go over to doors, and if you remember earlier in the presentation, I talked about, you know, testing your output. You know, you could turn off the elevator inputs and outputs temporarily and, you know, pulse those manually, or what's probably simpler is just going here and doing a door grant. So now when I do a door grant, you're going to get a pop-up here. If you leave this selection as 0, what you'll see is it pulses all of the elevator floors. But I don't want to do that. I want to check my floors individually. You know, I've got the elevator control company there. They want to see me pulse, you know, floor 3. So I'll pop in 3 here in the pop-up, and you'll see that the 3 button is lit up there. So now that we've tested, we know that our hardware is set up correctly. Now what we need to do, you know, the whole point of controlling the elevator is restricting access to just certain people. So that's what we're going to do next. We're going to set up elevator access levels. So let's pop over to roles. You're going to see elevator access level here. Now I'm going to set up a couple different levels. Actually, I'm going to set up 3 different levels. We're going to talk about 2 right now, and I'm going to come back to the 3rd one later. For the first one, I'm going to assume this is a multi-tenant environment. And I've got tenants living on the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th floor. And the 6th floor is the fitness center and the pool. So my tenants, they're going to get access to all of the floors. Floor 1's always, you know, you can always get to floor 1 because in my scenario, that's our path of egress. So something important to point out here, you know, when you're counting up the levels to be controlled, typically your ground floor is never controlled. Typically, people can always get to that floor. So, you know, definitely talk to the elevator company, talk to the end user. If you don't need to control the 1st floor, then don't set it up. Just for clarity, for the presentation, I set it up, but in my example, I really don't have to. So I could, you know, just start with floor 2. But let's just go ahead and assume floor 1's controlled. So I'm going to allow my tenants to access floors 1 through 5 anytime, 24/7. But the pool and fitness center, we don't want people up there hooting and hollering, you know, at 1 a.m. or dropping weights on the floor at 3 a.m. So we're going to only open the pool and fitness center from 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. So we don't want people to go to that floor any other time. So I'm going to apply that schedule to this elevator access level. So now that I've done that, I'm going to save my changes. Now, the elevator access level has to be incorporated into an access group. So if you notice here with the elevator access levels, we're only authorizing access to specific levels, but we haven't included the reader for the elevator cab. So that's where the access group comes in. So here we've got tenant access. I'm going to go over to my access groups. I've got a tenant access group already set up, and I'm going to allow this to be used 24/7. Obviously, there's going to be a little bit more restriction on floor 6, based on our elevator access level. Now, elevator access level, I have selected tenant access. And in this case, I went ahead and put the front door in there too. Don't have to, but if you just want this to be dedicated just to the elevator, you could just select the elevator cab. Now, here's a mistake I see oftentimes when I have people call me for assistance with elevators. They haven't put the elevator cab reader under members. So make sure you do that. So I'm going to save that. Of course, elevator or access groups rather are not assigned directly to identities. So I created a corresponding role that you see here, tenant access. And you can see that I've applied the access group to it. Now, let's go back and look at elevator access levels, because I've got another scenario. This is a multi-tenant building, but they, for whatever reason, they offer a fitness and pool package to non-residents. So in that case, you've got people that don't live there. You don't want them on tenant floors. You just want them to be able to get to the fitness center. So that's fine. We can do that. We'll just set up another elevator access list, or access level rather. So here I've created one for I've called it poll, but should be pool. Pool and fitness center. You can see they can still get to the first floor. It's the path of egress. But you see for floors 2 through 5, it's set to never active. And then they're restricted to the same hours as residents. So I use the pool fitness center schedule, so they'll be able to get up to the 6th floor once they present their credential between 6 a.m. and 11 p.m. And you can see that I've also done very similar with the access groups. I've selected front door and elevator. You could do a separate access group. Maybe you want, a separate schedule for the front door. Maybe you don't want people to get in 24/7. Actually, I've already done that here, rather. So these people are, these specific people don't live there. They don't need to be there at 2 a.m. because they can't use the pool or fitness center. So I've used that for the access level as well. So now they can't get in the front door, unless it's during the pool and fitness hours. And I applied that to a role. And again, that will allow me to assign it to an identity. So that takes care of a standard elevator control scenario with feedback. Now, when I present the card, since I have feedback in the messages section under the event, it'll say which specific floor that they accessed. Okay, so let's move on. Couple other scenarios that come up. One is, some of our customers will say, well, maybe it's an office building, and they want to unlock certain floors, during business hours and not require anybody to use their card. That's fine. You could do that. You would set up another elevator access level. And then you would go in and you would specify the times that you want the elevator to be unlocked, just like we did with the other access levels. And then you would go to the door configuration for the elevator. And you would go over to, here we go, on the hardware tab, you have custom access. Remember, you have that also with standard doors. It's just in a different spot. But you have that available within elevators too. So now you can override, the typical card-only mode, if you will, and you could unlock the elevator, based on the schedule that's in the elevator access level. So keep that scenario in mind. Now, another one that I have, I get a lot of questions on, let's go back to the multi-tenant facility. Multi-tenant facility, the lobby's always locked. Only people can get in are people that have a credential. But, it's very inconvenient for residents to have to go down to the front door to let people in. So they install an intercom system. Now with that intercom system, they want to be able to buzz the front door. Now that's great. You let somebody in the front door, and now they're still stuck in the lobby because they can't get up the elevator. So now we have, many of these environments that, they want to grant access to the front door, and they want to momentarily unlock a certain floor. Maybe the tenant lives on the second floor. So how do we do that? How do we unlock the second floor? Probably your first thought would be, hey, I'll go to Global Actions and I'll just, I'll pulse the relay, to the corresponding floor. Well, you can't do that because it's set up for elevator control. It's not going to allow you to pulse that relay. So that's okay. We still have a solution. We actually have a couple solutions. I'm going to go into one of the solutions. The other one I'll just kind of talk about, we'll start to run a little bit low on time. So let's just jump into this configuration example real quick. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to create a new elevator access level. So you can see here, I've created one. Now, what I've done is I've created a schedule for each floor. Now, what I've done with that, and the reason I've done that, is because I'm going to turn these schedules on and off when I need them. So, first example, somebody calls up to a tenant on the third floor, they buzz them into the front door, and then you want to unlock the third floor as well. So what we'll do is we'll use macros and triggers, and we'll temporarily set this third floor schedule. It's currently set to off. That's going to be its normal position. We're going to turn it on for a short period, and then we're going to turn it back off. So you'll see, let me go back over here to schedules just so you can see what that looks like. When you set up these schedules, it's very simple. Give it a name, set the mode to off. You don't have to put anything here. Because remember, when you have a schedule, you typically have it set to scan, then it's scanning for specific week or specific days and specific time frames, holidays, so on and so forth. We're not going to use it like a typical schedule. If you've been in one of my trainings, I talk about, set your mode is going to be set to scan 99% of the time. Well, here's the 1% of the time we're going to use the on and off. So here's our manual elevator control schedule. I'm going to set it to off. Don't have to do anything else. Real simple. You can see I duplicated that. I did for floor 6 for another reason that I'll show you in a minute. But typically, you wouldn't let your tenants buzz people up to the pool and fitness center, because that's just for tenants and members. So let me go into a little bit more detail on how that's set up. So now I said we're going to use macros and triggers. So I'm going to go to the panel for my elevator. In this case, I'm using an EP1501. I'm going to go to macros. And let's see, we talked about the third floor. So let me click on third floor here. We'll take a look. I created a macro. Now, I put in a very short time frame here. You're probably going to use something more realistic for the customer's environment. I'm just impatient. So let me talk about what I've done here. So you've got somebody that's, you're going to buzz them into the front door. that could be part of this macro too. You could have a command to do a door grant at the front door. But I don't want to immediately unlock the third floor because they need time to get through the door and get to the elevator cab. So maybe I delay 10 seconds, 15 seconds, whatever the case. Then I'm going to turn the schedule on, and let's take a look at that. So I'm using the time zone control command, and I'm going to specifically turn on the third floor. And I'm using the function temporary set, which temporarily turns on that schedule. And it's part of group A. Once I turn that on, I'm going to leave it on for 5 seconds. Again, you're probably going to want to give your visitor, more time to select the floor. And then after that 5 seconds, I'm going to turn it back off. So this is just a momentary grant access to the third floor. Now, what I would do, this command or the trigger is going to be the intercom system. So a lot of these multi-tenant intercom systems have relay outputs. So you would assign basically from the intercom system, you would assign a output for each floor. So that would come into an input on ACM. Remember, it can't be an input on a board that's being used for elevator control. It needs to be just a standard subcontroller. So in this case, I've set up, you'll see here, these inputs for each of my floors. The numbers here correspond to which floors. So in this case, I've set up a trigger for my third floor. Basically, when I get this input point goes into alarm, so the relay output from the intercom system closes, then I want to execute the macro that I showed you previously. So how that would work, I would hit, let's see, make sure I hit the right one, third floor. You can see I'm trying it. 5 seconds hasn't expired yet. Oh, there we go. Now the 5 seconds is hit. So now I can select for the third floor. Now my 5 second timer is expired, so I can't get in there. So you can see that's how we can grant momentary access in those types of scenarios. You could also use global actions and turn on and off that schedule that I showed you. However, you don't have the timing. You don't have the delay function. So that delay would have to come from the intercom system. And basically you would just, when the output's in alarm, you would set the schedule to on, and then when it returns to normal, you would turn it off. So just remember, you have the ability to use global actions. It's just the timing will have to be done by the intercom system. So let's take one more example, and I want to leave time for questions here. I'm just going to open up a quick dashboard. I think that was Friday. Jared talked about maps and dashboards. I'm going to open up a quick one for elevator control. We get this request sometimes, especially with civic centers and concert venues and things like that, where they'll want to manually unlock certain floors, when they're moving equipment in or whatever. Doing a momentary grant to let somebody on the elevator real quick, having to do that over and over is kind of a burden for the security folks. So, and I apologize, we're running out of time. I've basically created global actions. I'll show you real quick here. To do what I'm talking about here, if I wanted to do just a quick door grant similar to what we did with, in the tenant scenario, again, we're not using the door grant command, but we'll just functionally, that's the way it's going to work. To be able to execute that same functionality from a dashboard or a map, I would just create a global action that executes that macro. So that same macro that we just created, I just created a global action. My type is panel macro. I'm going to execute group A actions, and then that's the name of the specific macro. So now that lets me do the momentary grant. Now the other scenario where you need to unlock it for people to to move equipment in, that's where I've changed the schedule mode using a global action. So we've been talking about the third floor. I've created a global action. I'm going to set the schedule mode to on, and that's for the third floor. And then remember, with our global actions, they typically come in pairs. The first one to initiate whatever change, and then the second action is to restore. So you can see here, I've created another action, turn the schedule back off. So just real quick on the maps here, and then we're going to open it up to questions. You can see I just need to do a momentary grant global action that executes the macro I created, gives them a short amount of time to select the second floor. Here, I just want to unlock the second floor and leave it unlocked. So now I've done that. Now I should be able to go over here and select floor 2, which I can. And then if I come back in, I don't know, 3 or 4 minutes, we'll pretend 3 or 4 minutes has expired, I could hit it again. So now they're done moving equipment onto the second floor. We'll just put it back into normal operations here. And now I should not be able to hit the second floor, which I cannot. So another thing to keep in mind, you could use job specification to execute those same global actions. So maybe they didn't call the security center at the last minute and say, hey, I need access now. And maybe you could schedule it ahead of time. You could do a job spec that fires these same global actions. You know, set it up to fire at 10 o'clock, let them in from 10 o'clock, and then at 2 a.m. when they should be done, fire this global action that restores it back to normal operations. So that being said, I apologize. I ran a little bit longer than I intended to. Did want to open it up to any questions.
Hey, Rob, so we got some questions. They all have been answered. I'm just going to go ahead and talk about a couple here real quick. First question here, someone asked, can the IO and the controller be used for non-cab control, aka the elevator penthouse door? The answer is, well, if it's in the controller, right? But you're not going to use
the controller,
right? So we're not going to use the controller for elevator control. You cannot use that. You have to use a subcontroller. So in this case, if you use the controller that has a subcontroller tied in, you can, right? So the controller, like LP1502, you can do that. But if it's a subcontroller, you cannot. So once you dedicate that subcontroller to be elevator control, that's it, right? You can only use for elevator control. So if you put an MR52 to do 4 floors on an elevator control, and you still have another 2 outputs, you cannot use those outputs for anything else. They're just not available. Okay, just want to make sure that everybody understands that.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Francisco. And one other thing real quick as we're talking through these questions, if you all don't mind answering those, there's a couple more poll questions. I'll throw them up there for a short time and then cycle through. Sorry, should have presented those earlier, but if you all don't mind answering those, that would be great.
The other question that we had here is, what is the ACM license? If ACM license is required for elevator control? It's not. It's part of ACM. Just want to make sure that you have enough reader licenses, and the necessary hardware, right? The reader outputs, if you're just doing elevator control, and if you want to do elevator control with a floor tracking, in other words, you know what button the person pressed, then you need input points as well.
Perfect, thank you.
Absolutely. Someone is asking if will be a link for this information. So we do have, if you look in the handouts in this presentation here, in the control tools, you'll see there is ability to download the presentation there. If you don't see in the poll, Aaron, just try to come up a maximized. If your screen is maximized, you should be able to see a secondary screen with the poll. Let us know if that doesn't work, and you can just answer the poll in the questions if you want to.
Yeah, I'm launching the fourth one here. Do we have any other questions, Francisco? I missed.
So no, I think we're good there. Just one, someone's asking, showing poll results, not questions. You should have a secondary screen other than the presentation that shows the poll. If not, just
they want another poll.
Yeah, and you just got another poll, right?
Yep, and I'm closing the 4th one and I'm launching the 5th one here. There we go.
All right.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate everybody's time. No more questions, Francisco. I haven't seen any more pop in. As always, reach out to us if you have questions. It's always good to talk through these elevator control applications. Like I said, there are some subtleties and things that you have to consider, before you lay out your hardware. But with that being said, Francisco, I know Jared's not on today. Do you remember what we're talking about licensing on Friday, if I remember correctly. Does that sound right?
I can take a quick look here. It sounds about right. Let me take a quick look.
Yeah. So I'm going to assume it's right unless Francisco tells me otherwise. Definitely check in with us on Friday. Join the webinar. Jared's going to be covering ACM licensing. As many of you know, the licensing strategy changed in ACM 6. We do get questions about, several different licensing questions that come in, and we're going to have a guest speaker come in to talk about ACM licensing. So make sure you guys join us.
That's right.
And Francisco, what do you?
Yeah, he's talking about licensing Friday, noon Pacific time, folks. Don't forget Pacific time on Friday. Okay, and then and then me on Monday, the following Monday, the 11th at noon Eastern time, we'll be talking about ACM Verify. So it's one feature that is in ACM that surprisingly very few people use today. So come and see it because it's an interesting feature that can do a whole lot of different applications. So come and join us for those next Lunch and Learn.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for joining. Really appreciate it and look forward to seeing you all on the next Lunch and Learn session. Have a great afternoon.